today we are going to talk about finding the midpoint of a segment. We have 3 questions we're going to answer. How do I find the midpoint given 2 points? How do I find an endpoint given a midpoint and an endpoint? How do I use a midpoint to find the length of a segment? Hopefully you get all 3 of those questions down in your notes. So we're going to review a little bit from class. Just a reminder that the midpoint is the middle of the segment. It's the exact middle. It cuts the segment in half, which means you get 2 equal pieces. It cuts it in half, 2 equal pieces. This bottom portion, the midpoint formula, we developed that in class. So you add the 2 x values together and divide by 2. You add the 2 y values together and divide by 2. It's like the average of each because you're finding the middle of each because the midpoint, again, cuts the segment into 2 pieces. So we're going to go through a few examples to practice those skills and answer those questions. So the first example is just find the midpoint. So we're going to use our exact midpoint formula. So I'm going to take x1 plus x2 and divide by 2. And I'm going to take y1 and y2 and divide by 2. So my x1 is going to be -2. I like to label these x1, y1, x2, y2 so I don't get them mixed up. So my x1 is -2. My x2 is +4, and I'm going to add those together and then divide by 2. My y1 is 3 and my y2 is 11. And again, I'm going to add those together and divide by 2. So I have -2 plus 4, which gives me a +2 over 2. And then 3 plus 11 is 14, divided by a +2. 2 over 2 is 1, and 14 over 2 is 7. So my midpoint is at 1, 7. Hopefully that is a refresher of the practice we did in class. And that's the exact middle of A and B. So we're going to move on to example number 2, where we are given an endpoint R and a midpoint M, and we need to find the other endpoint, which is S. So to do this, I'm going to graph just so we can have a visual, but you don't have to. Just it's going to be a little bit of help for us. So R is at 11, -5. So positive 11, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. And then -5, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So I'm going to put my point there, and that is R. I'm going to put my midpoint is at -4, -4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So there is my midpoint. So it looks like my other endpoint, if I were to connect these, my other endpoint is going to be somewhere over here. So maybe in the 3rd quadrant. Okay. So I'm given the first endpoint right here. This is the endpoint. And M here is our midpoint. So when we think about what we have, I have part of what I'm going to add together to get the midpoint. So I'm going to kind of set it up with what I'm missing. I am missing S, which I could call x2, y2, because that's what it is in the midpoint formula. So I'm just going to set it up. So if I were to find the midpoint of R and S, it would be 11 plus whatever that x2 value is divided by 2. And then if I were to find the y value, it would be -5 plus that y2 value divided by 2. But in this case, I don't know what x and y are. What I do know is what they're going to equal. I know what the midpoint is. So I'm going to set it equal to right here, what it's telling me, the midpoint, -4 and -4. Now, all I have to do is a little bit of algebra, and I will get my 2 values that I'm missing for my coordinate. So I'm going to work on x first. I need to clear the fraction, so I'm going to multiply both sides by 2. On the left, these 2's are going to reduce to a 1, and I'm going to get 11 plus x sub 2. And then -4 times 2 is going to give me a -8. Move the 11 over, and I get that my x value is a -19. Then I move on to my y. Again, I'm going to do the same thing, multiply by 2 on both sides, and I get negative 5 plus y sub 2 equals negative 8. In this case, I'm going to add the 5 over, and I get that my y value is going to be a negative 3. So it looks like my other endpoint s is going to be at negative 19, negative 3. All right, awesome. We're going to move on to our third example. Our third example says, given the midpoint t, find the length of ht. So t is the midpoint of hj, and then I have some information here that hj is 14. So I'm going to label that. hj is 14. Since t is the midpoint, that means that ht and jt are equal. They are the same value. So all I'm going to do is take my total 14 and divide it by 2. Since t is the midpoint, it cuts it in half. So that is going to be 7. So each length here is 7. So ht is equal to 7. Okay, we're going to step it up one notch. And instead of having whole number values for the length of the segments, we're going to use some algebraic expressions, but everything still holds true. M is the midpoint, so it's the middle of PR, and I'm trying to find the length of MR. So I know that M is the middle, which means that PM is equal to MR. So all I'm going to do is set their algebraic expressions to represent their lengths equal to each other. So I have 4x minus 12, and it's going to equal negative 2x plus 21. I'm going to combine some like terms. I'm going to add 2x, and so I have 6x minus 12 is equal to 21. And then I'm going to add 12, and I get 6x equals 33. Divide by 6, 33 is not divisible by 6, but they're both divisible by 3, so if I divide a 3 out of both, I get 11 over 2. I'm not done yet. I found x, which is 11 over 2, but it's asking me for the length of MR, so I've got to plug it back in to MR. So negative 2 times 11 over 2 plus 21. Negative 2 times 11 over 2 is going to give me a negative 22 over 2 plus 21, and negative 22 over 2 is going to give me a negative 11 plus 21, which gives me 10. So the length of MR is 10, and that is our answer. We could also have plugged it in to 4x minus 12, and why can we plug it into that one? Because they're equal. They are equal because PR has been cut in half. Okay, we're going to move on to our last example. So it says, given P is the midpoint of a segment QR, find the length of QR. So I don't know what the other endpoint is. I could find the other endpoint, but I'm actually going to find the length of my segment QP and then just double it, because the midpoint again is the middle. It's cutting my segment in half. So I'm going to use distance formula to find the length of QP, and then I'm going to double it. So this is for QP. And just a reminder, distance formula is x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. And I'm just going to plug in my numbers. So I'm going to call x2 2, and this is going to be y2, and I'm going to call this x1 and y1. So all I'm going to do is plug in my numbers. So my x2 is 2 minus my x1, which is negative 2 squared, plus y2, which is 1, minus my y1, which is 3. And don't forget about the square root, it comes down with it. So 2 minus negative 2, that's like addition. So that is actually 4 squared. And then 1 minus 3 is a negative 2 squared, all under the square root still. 4 squared is 16, and negative 2 squared is 4. 16 plus 4 is 20. 20 can be simplified. I'm sorry, the square root of 20 can be simplified. It is the square root of 4 times the square root of 5. The square root of 4 is 2. And then the square root of 5 stays there. So the length of QP is 2 root 5, but QP is only half the distance. So for QR, I'm going to have to double QP. So QR is going to equal 2 times 2 root 5. So QR is going to be 4 root 5. Great. Okay, so hopefully you got some information about midpoint, how to use midpoint with different segments, how to find the midpoint, and how to find the length given a midpoint.